On paper, Penny Racers sounds like the kind of game which I would instantly enjoy. I love racing games, I dig kart style multiplayer races in particular, and with added customization features and upgrades, I just knew that I was going to enjoy this game. However, like many games, the promise from the developer on paper doesn't always turn out to be in the final game released. Penny Racers is an unusual one. Part of the Choro Q series from Japan, THQ picked up the international publishing rights at the same time this game was released in Japan in the summer of 1998. Not knowing what exactly they should do with the game, they then sat on the rights to publish it worldwide whilst they figured out exactly what to do with it. The name Choro Q would mean next to nothing to Western gamers aside from those who are keenly following the import release lists or were lucky enough to have a Japanese game section in their local game store. After deciding to rebrand the game for the Western release, Penny Racers finally landed in the West in 1999, and developed by Locomotive Games, this was an unusual racing game. The core element of Penny Racers is the sheer amount of customization it offered. Sure, many of us who like simulation racing games were used to being able to tweak and adjust our cars, but in more arcade-like races this wasn't so common at the time. With over 114 parts to play with in 8 different categories, it sounded like a cool mix of arcade racing and the ability to personalise your setup. The reality, however, is very different, and one which I feel kills a game almost immediately. Starting off with your Class C licence, you start each race against 5 other drivers. The top 3 places at the end of the race get to choose a part to steal or swap from the 3 losers. Naturally, the winner race gets the first pick and they get to basically steal anything that they would like. The problem is, however, that the game is just about manageable if you are winning, but as the difficulty increases the game becomes even harder. This is because you finish in the bottom 3 more often and then an opponent is likely to steal parts from your car. This could be the faster engine you have, the better tyres more suited to the course, even your weapons which you'll need to blast your way to the front of the leaderboard. With most other racing games, if you can't master a track, you'll just keep on practicing to master each turn, but with Penny Racers it becomes much more difficult, because every time you fail, your opponents will make you weaker. And because the abilities of your car will change every time you get parts taken off you, it's like learning how to handle and use an entirely new car every time. It's for this reason that I feel many people would become frustrated to the point of quitting almost before they've even passed the basic C license of races. To be fair, that's also the time that I lost much interest in this game also. Sure, the concept is cool, but in reality is that for this version of the game it just makes the overall experience tiresome. Adding to this is the fact that the courses are all taking place on different surfaces such as road, off-road and snow. If you have a car which doesn't have snow tyres, then it's near impossible to race the snow courses. So instead, you have to keep racing the road courses in a hope that one of your opponents who finish in the bottom 3 has the snow tyres, which you'll then need to try and take away to then go back to the snow races to have any chance of progressing. Now that was just one example, but essentially it turns the entire game into a lottery of being able to acquire the parts that you need to progress. Then, when you can finally progress, all it takes is one race where you finish in the bottom 3, and that part that you've worked so hard to get can be taken away from you in an instant, resulting in you needing to repeat the entire process again. The range of cars in the game is nice, and they're all cel-shaded, unlicensed versions of cars you will know and love, such as those from Volkswagen, Porsche, NSX and so on, with a couple of comedy cars thrown in. Aside from the car customization which I've already slated, there are also upgrades which can tweak and mod the appearance of your car for those who more care about aesthetics rather than performance of your vehicle. With the ability to add weapons to your car, this game takes this aspect slightly differently than many other combat racers. Rather than picking up weapons on the courses, this time you need to acquire them and then equip them to your car before each race. These vary from standard mine type weapons to projectiles and defense shields. Personally, I felt that in the single player experience the weapons are much more of a hindrance than anything at all. The courses quickly become littered with far too many mines, and tracks which you so much as drive in one wrong area you will find you are blown up way too many times. And when you do blow up, you end up in a seemingly endless roll which takes far too long to recover from. Add to this smoke bombs, which pretty much make the entire sections of the course invisible, then it really feels that the balance of the weapons has not been fully checked and tweaked before the game's release. A really nice idea in the game though is the ability to create your own courses, and the track editor is fairly easy to pick up once you've dabbled with it a little. You can create both circuits and point-to-point stages, giving it an almost rally-like feel. And you can also customize the surface, and there are plenty of parts such as water elements, bumps, jumps and slopes. There are also some preset custom courses built into the Create a Track editor, but they're more or less silly courses for you to drive on. The main game courses though are an interesting mix, which stick to the stereotypical arcade tropes. You'll have road courses, snow levels, caves and so on. It's not terribly inspired, and some of the track design is quite poor, which takes away any sense of speed as there are far too many pinpoint turns. Combining this with the game's frankly terrible controls, it creates a real mess of a driving experience. The cars have very wide turn radius, which makes your car take an age to turn even the simplest of corners. And yes, you can power slide, but more often than not this will lead to your car losing traction and simply flipping and rolling over, taking you off the course. Again, if your car has the wrong tyres for the course, then you're pretty much wasting your time trying to play, because you have the sloppiest controls imaginable and most of your time will be spent trying to get back onto the track. Rounding off this squalid single player experience are the mixed graphics. Now surprisingly, I actually enjoyed the cel shaded car models, and seeing wacky looking versions of some classic ones was one of the game's few highlights. As soon as you look at the courses however, you'll see that this cartoonish look is very low quality. The textures are a blocky mess, giving the terrain an ugly look, and everything just comes across far too pixelated and low quality. Now sure, you could argue that this was a 1998 release in Japan, and you'd be right. But for a game that THQ released in 1999 in the West, the game was terrible looking even just a year after the Japanese release. The game's frame rate is also a big issue. There are times when for absolutely no reason it almost feels like it drops to 0 FPS, which throws you out of the experience. And at other times it will seem to shoot up to what feels like 60 frames a second, again for no reason. It also seems to be completely random, and this doesn't seem to be caused by other drivers in the area or weapons going off, and so you're often just waiting for it to happen at any moment. Regardless, the frame rate isn't locked down, and it gives the overall visuals a sloppy and erratic feel. The game's audio is also not great. The fast-paced, pop-style music would normally fit this type of game, but here, not so much. The tunes are repetitive, and whilst there are one or two which are catchy, the remaining tracks just become irritating. And this is enhanced further when they speed up the tempo on the final lap and they become even more irritating and sound completely ridiculous. The effects too are your basic stock effects, and the cars for the best part sound about as powerful as a Micro Machines toy from back in the day. If however you can find friends who also enjoy this game, then the multiplayer mode could be of interest. If you use your own custom creations, the multiplayer works well because each race will have parts at stake, and winning or losing items between friends would be sure to lead to some crazy racing action and no doubt some arguments. But I sincerely doubt that in this day and age anyone would care enough or even be able to find 3 other friends to huddle around a TV to play this again. Penny Racers was a game with so much promise. There was an N64 sequel which was released in Japan only after this game sold poorly. Now I'll eventually get around to covering that on an episode of the N64 Japanese Eye, but in terms of treating Penny Racers as a single game in isolation, it really was a letdown. It's a classic example of a game having a really hot spec sheet, but the final game turning out to be somewhat of a dud. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what you thought of this slightly unusual title. I'd also love to know of a game from this era that you read about and were eagerly awaiting its release, only to find out that even though it sounded great on paper, the final version was anything but. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time.